All right, I wanted to address one other thing in panning. Basically, when you're doing panning, there's a couple different ways to do it. If you dug around on the internet and bought a bunch of plugins and spent forever studying it and looking, there's so many different ways to do panning that it's not even funny and you can get lost in it. The basic thing is in your DAW, and you've heard me talk about this if you watch the videos on this channel, that you buy the professional grade version. The stock plugins in there should do your basic panning needs on either the tracks or on the plugins or automation. To do your whatever kind of panning that you want, you can either just use your plugins to work on the balances with just your basic plugins that you have. You can get some plugins. This one's a free one. And to do some panning techniques where that it does certain panning shapes over certain distances in time that you can build with to do things that repeat, if you like some kind of effect that goes through there that can give some really cool effects that you can mess around with. The thing is to understand about those is don't get lost in that. I mean, you might come up with something and just want to do something cool now and then, artistic creation, and pull something out like this and do something really cool with your panning, but just don't get lost in it. Like, well, that's not the basics of your stereo field and trying to build your stereo field. But if you start messing with them, that it's obviously going to just complicated your stereo field immensely, and the other instruments around there, unless it's soloed, that you more than likely want to pay attention to what's going on around it. And trying to build that instrument differently as you're doing some strange, panning techniques with it, that are maybe really unique and cool, but you really have to focus on the stereo field behind it also, and what else might be interacting on with that, or what else might be a stable foundation for that to work on top of, or behind, to where you've got a stable foundation, you've got something else in the background that's doing some wild stereo effects, or some wild panning effects. Those are a couple of different ways to look at it, but very basic. Does that make sense? And those are a couple of things to keep in mind. Your basic stock plugins and just a basic pan to get the basic set, things like the pan laws and stuff like that. You have to read about what the one in your DAW is doing, so you have an understanding of what that means when you're using it. And your automation is great. Your automation is great for panning because you can do all kinds of things with your panning and your automation that are just really cool. On automation all over the place. And if you have like a DAW that does automation to where you can take one of the parameters and actually edit the parameters like that, to where you've got another track that's basically that track that you can go on there and do something like read or write or latch or something like that, and it'll write as you go along and actually move that parameter as you move through the track, for doing panning, and then going back and you can redo it, and stuff like that. That's another huge automation tool for doing your panning, which is really cool. I'm not going to get into a whole lot of that. Basically try to keep it as simple as possible. Even when you're doing something really complex, try to break it up into little sections to where that whole complex thing you're trying to do is broken into smaller, easier parts to attain for complex things, and really pay attention to what's going on behind it in the mix when you start doing really complex type of panning effects. Anything like that that's going on like that, that's having a direct effect on your stereo field and where things are sitting. Does that make sense? Because that might start changing the way it perceives how things are sitting when you start doing that. And to really pay attention to it one small section at a time, one step at a time, to really work through it really well, so that the effect you're working with is really complementary to the stereo field that you've been working on. And it's really good to approach those things afterwards. I mean, you might get an idea and then, kind of basically shape it out and set it off the side and get the foundation while you're thinking about what that might be doing, whether that's behind the instruments or on top of the instruments or mixed in the middle of it somewhere, or in the high end or in the low end or in the mid range. and, really pay attention to what's going on there, because the frequency separations and them having their own spaces, directly related to your panning and that having its own space also. So the more of that kind of stuff you do, the more complex it can get, and try to break it into smaller sections. So when you start doing some really cool panning stuff, that you're taking all that stuff into consideration, and so that you're doing it one step at a time, so that the end product comes out well thought through and done well. But the basic stereo field that we've been talking about will be being affected by that, and take that into consideration. And I'm not going to get real complex into what all kind of panning stuff you can do. You can do all kinds of different kind of panning stuff. It's real obvious what that means. Something is going to be somewhere else in the stereo field, and you're going to move it there, or you're going to put it there, and then other things are going to be working with it in the stereo field to produce the stereo field of where things sit in the mix in the stereo field. So it's that simple, and don't get it that complicated. And as that changes, take everything into consideration that's part of the sound of the finished product, as the stereo field is changing as you do things. And keep that in mind as you go through any changes in the song and any complex panning you might do. And if you keep it that simple in your head, you probably get through it, and you probably do some really cool stuff. And the other thing I want to address with things like binaural pan, surround sound, when you're working in a studio and you're trying to make things and just sound. Binaural pan, you got to be real careful with. It can be a really cool tool, and sometimes you can actually just throw it on there and use it for stereo widening in some things, and can do a cool thing. And sometimes it can just make a muddy mess. And sometimes it's better to use it with separate groups or separate tracks, rather than trying to put it on a whole mix that starts making a whole mix start to sound muddy. Sometimes you can. Sometimes you can use it just on sections, and it really might add this widening thing to the stereo field, that's enhancing the other things we're talking about, as far as, enhancing the stereo field, doing stereo widening. And that can be a huge tool to think about. The other thing that I wanted to talk about is doing mid-side things. A real simple thing when you're doing mid-side stuff is that, even something like this Voxengo plugin, which is real simple, that you're dealing with your mids and your sides on your track, meaning what's out there and what's in the center, and trying to deal with panning that. There's a whole nother thing you can get into. These kind of tools can be really cool, but they can also just make you a mess real quick. You can be sitting there and you start trying to put all this stuff together, and pretty soon, that if you've even listened to these 3 videos that we've talking about stereo field, that you all of a sudden you've got all this stuff you've done in all these different tracks and all these different groups and on your mix, and you've got this mess. It's like you've got, tons of processors all over the place, and it's like, wow, and your CPU is going, it's like, and it's like a lot of those tools can be really cool, but have an understanding of what you're trying to do. Keep it as simple in your mind for each section of the song or for what you're trying to do, and try not to get it real complicated, and have a real good understanding of what you're going to pull that tool out. You want to pan the sides, you want to pan the mids, of the mid side. And if you don't understand that, just Google it, and you hopefully won't find a confusing answer. I haven't done a video on these tools yet, because I don't use them a lot, because I find that by the time I got done doing all my work, I don't have a big reason why I'd even want to use that. I already did all of the work that I wanted to, the way I should have done it in my mix process, and I don't need some plugin to mess around with it. I'll go back to those tracks if I'm having some issue. But it can be cool every now and then. You pull it out and you say, well, maybe I'll just throw that on there. What does that do? It can be a cool plugin, but it can also just be another knob that you pull out, to mess around with, that just, screws up your mix, or screws up some shit that you should have done correctly the first time. Does that make sense? And no disrespect to anybody on that one, but that can be very true. So that's another tool, but just be careful of that, because that kind of stuff, when you're working on panning on that stuff, that you really what it's doing. I mean, how far out in the side, how much, what in the mids is it doing? I mean, what exactly is that algorithm doing before I start turning the knob around? And a lot of time that kind of stuff just comes to hearing it, what it might be doing. You might get a plug-in like this and go, well, it does really cool for that when I want to do this or that, and it's like, that's cool, as long as, you don't get lost in it. You don't end up with this panning nightmare of mixing. I mean, after you've gone through everything we've talked about, and then you get stuck in your mid-pan panning, and it's like, you're like going, oh no, dude, what happened there? One step at a time, and really understand what you're trying to do with that, and try to keep your panning as simple as possible. And when you're going to do something very complex, try to keep that complex thing that you're doing as simple as possible. And try to keep everything else that's involved related, because you stick something like this on an entire mix or 4 groups, on a bus, that, it's doing a whole lot of shit to your audio. I mean, it really is, it's not, I mean, it's really, changing the audio in ways that, on a plugin like this, that it's not going to tell you exactly what it's doing, and you can hear what it's doing, but it may have an adverse effect on your audio in the mix entirety, and keep that in mind. And simple tools are better. You got a tool that does something simple and it's not really complex, but it can do a complex thing with the simple tool that it is better to go that way than having some complex tool that really can just make a mess out of what you're working with. So in this video, I just kind of wanted to kind of relate that, because the basic tools are better to stick with. And when you start messing with tools that do complex things, really take into consideration what that's doing to the mix, and really focus on the mix and them as 2 separate entities, and then them coming together as one entity in the final mix. And really think about that as you're doing that. And if you do, and you really think that through, that whatever things you are doing will come out better. You've got this sweep in, or this coming forward and then off to the right somewhere, and where is it coming from? How is it sitting in the mix? Behind the instruments, coming forward and be off to the left, and there's so many different ways that you can work that, and to do panning effects that, that you can be drifting behind the bass, or drifting behind the keyboards, but then coming forward a bit and back, and then sweeping over to the right, coming up behind the guitar or behind the vocals, and I mean, and there is, lots of cool, just really cool stuff that you can do. Just be careful that you've got its space for it, so it doesn't get lost in the mix, or it's not some cool thing that's just mudding the mix. That you've made space for these panning things, and these really complex panning things you've done that are really going to have their own space, that are really going to be heard and not lost in the other stereo field stuff that you've been working on. And you are creating the stereo field wrapped around those, and the stereo field wrapped around that, to create, an interaction that's some cool effect. And that may sound very complex, but that whole issue can be very complex, because, you just put a sweep on there from right to left, and it doesn't come out exactly like, Bob's thing that you heard, and you're wondering why. Well, that is a lot of the reason probably why, because he might have spent a lot of time thinking about how he was going to do it. What all ways can I do that? What can happen there? And what can I add to it? What other instruments can I combine with it in the sweep? Or can I, sweep something off to the left while that's coming right, that kind of counteracts it. So as it's coming, that other thing behind it's drifting off to the left, but at a lower volume. Well, that's coming up louder on the right side, and then sweeping forward and then drifting back. Well, the other thing kind of comes forward and then fades out. I mean, you've just mixed your whole panning thing up into that just now crossed the lines into your decibel mixing and your frequency mixing scheme of the song, which it will do sometimes. But when it does that, you got to stop in one section at a time and really think about what is happening there and how you're going to work that out, and take your time and do a good job of it. And try to keep the concept simple and in small sections as you work through it, to come out with something really cool, really well thought out, that has its own space. And that's kind of what I wanted to touch on this one. And I didn't get too complex on that, because that whole issue can be hugely complex. But if you can understand the simple concept of that, when you start to try to do that stuff, that all the complexities of a can do become much simpler, and it actually comes out sounding better because it's been built for the panning and the effects in the stereo field that you've built. And I hope that helped, and peace, hope, love.